The assignment and a quiet cafe. The sound of clinking cups and soft jazz music filled the air in the little cafe, tucked away in a quiet corner of downtown Los Angeles. Agent Naomi Carter adjusted her glasses and settled deeper into her chair by the window, her gaze ostensibly focused on her laptop screen. She was an expert at blending in. Today, she was just another customer sipping on her latte, typing furiously, as if absorbed in an intense email or work document. Her attire was a carefully chosen disguise, casual yet polished, hinting at an office worker enjoying her break rather than an FBI agent on a high-stakes mission. The real purpose of her visit to this cafe was to observe a particular individual, a man she had been following for the better part of 6 months. Thomas DeLuca, the slippery mastermind of an international art and antiquities trafficking ring, was known for his cunning ability to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Today, the Bureau had finally secured intel that DeLuca would be here to finalize a deal involving a stolen artifact, a deal Naomi had to intercept. She'd been briefed on his movements, aware of his reputation as someone who could sense law enforcement presence from a mile away. Her task was clear: gather evidence of his dealings without revealing her true identity. Naomi's handler, Agent Jameson, sat in a surveillance van a few blocks away, monitoring her every move. His voice crackled softly in her earpiece, breaking the steady hum of ambient sounds. "Naomi, are you in position?" he asked, his voice low and calm. She shifted slightly, taking a careful look around the cafe. The morning crowd was a mix of regular patrons, a group of students hunched over laptops, a man in his 50s reading the paper, and a few others engrossed in their devices or books. DeLuca hadn't arrived yet, but her instincts told her it wouldn't be long. "Affirmative," she whispered, using the act of stirring her coffee as a cover for her response. "Everything's set." Naomi glanced at her wristwatch, which wasn't just a timepiece but a sophisticated recording device linked to her earpiece and Jameson's receiver. Her cover was thorough. She was a consultant for a tech firm, an innocent businesswoman taking a break between meetings, far removed from the gritty world of law enforcement. It was a meticulously crafted persona, a routine perfected through years of training. She felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that always accompanied field operations, the sensation that every person, every sound, every glance could hold a hidden threat. But today, something felt different, a slight unease that nagged at the back of her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that despite her expertise, she was being watched. The door of the cafe shined as it opened, and Naomi's eyes flickered briefly in that direction. Her target had arrived. Thomas DeLuca, a tall, slender man in his late 40s, with a silver mane that only added to his air of sophistication, strode in. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, he looked every bit the part of a successful businessman. But Naomi knew the truth behind that polished veneer. He was ruthless, charming, and dangerous. She watched as he took a seat at a table across the room, where he ordered an espresso and immediately pulled out his phone. The staff seemed to know him, exchanging courteous nods and brief greetings. DeLuca was a regular here, which only underscored how crucial it was for her not to draw any attention. "Target is in position," Naomi murmured into her coffee cup, barely moving her lips. "Good," came Jameson's voice. "Remember, stay in character. We need confirmation of his contact, and anything you can pick up from their conversation." Naomi nodded, mentally rehearsing her lines, going over every possible scenario. Her years of experience had taught her that the smallest slip could turn an operation upside down, but her focus on the mission steadied her nerves. DeLuca's phone buzzed, and Naomi could see a slight smile creep onto his face as he checked the screen. Within seconds, a man joined him, a nondescript figure in a dark trench coat who exchanged a brief handshake with DeLuca before they settled into a hushed conversation. Naomi's heart quickened. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Her finger hovered near her watch, ready to activate the recording device if she could get closer. She took a deep breath, preparing to discreetly shift seats to better capture their exchange. But then she felt it. That sense of being watched intensified, as if a pair of eyes were boring into her back. She straightened slightly, instinctively glancing at the door just as it swung open again. A tall, broad-shouldered police officer strode into the cafe, his uniform immaculate, his stride full of confidence. He scanned the room, and Naomi saw his gaze land on her, with a sharpness that made her pulse quicken. Jameson's voice crackled in her ear. "Naomi, stay focused. Don't let anyone distract you." But it was easier said than done. The officer's presence threw her off balance. She recognized him almost immediately. Officer Mark Thompson, notorious for his brashness and rigid sense of authority. He was well known in the precincts for his by-the-book approach that often bordered on prejudice. She had encountered him once in passing during a previous investigation and had found his attitude grating. Thompson's stare was uncomfortably intense, his expression unreadable as he made his way toward her. Naomi's stomach twisted, realizing she'd been singled out. She kept her gaze fixed on her laptop screen, hoping he'd lose interest. But she could feel his heavy footsteps approaching, and within moments, he was standing at her table. "Excuse me, miss," Thompson said, his tone laced with an unsettling mix of authority and condescension. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" Naomi took a steadying breath, forcing a polite smile as she looked up. "Just enjoying a coffee," she replied, maintaining a calm demeanor. "Is there a problem, officer?" His gaze narrowed slightly, scrutinizing her as though she were a puzzle he was determined to solve. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, glancing pointedly at her laptop and coffee. "You don't exactly look like a regular here." The implied judgment in his words hit her like a slap, but Naomi kept her composure. She understood the delicate line she had to walk. Escalating the situation could jeopardize the operation, but giving in to his intimidation could compromise her cover. "I'm here on a work break," she said smoothly, hoping her simplicity would diffuse his suspicion. But Thompson wasn't backing down. "Work break, huh?" He folded his arms, as though blocking her escape. "I think I'm going to need to see some ID." Her heart pounded, and she could feel Jameson's tension on the other end of the line. This wasn't part of the plan. Showing her ID would only further complicate matters, but her hesitation seemed to fuel Thompson's determination. With a practiced calm, Naomi reached into her bag and handed over her ID. She hoped that revealing her civilian cover would satisfy him, allowing her to return to her mission. But Thompson's expression hardened as he read the card, his eyes flashing with something like satisfaction. "Naomi Carter," he repeated, barely glancing at the card before his gaze returned to her with a challenging stare. "Care to tell me what you're really doing here?" Naomi forced a steady smile, willing herself to remain calm. "Officer, I'm just having coffee. If that's all, I'd like to finish in peace." Thompson's eyes held a cold, unyielding suspicion. "You don't exactly blend in, Miss Carter," he said, his voice lowering, almost as if he relished the discomfort he was causing. He looked around the cafe, his gaze passing over DeLuca's table and then back to her. Naomi felt the sinking realization that if this encounter went on much longer, DeLuca might suspect something. "Just following protocol," Thompson continued, his tone almost mocking. "Why don't you come with me for a little chat outside?" Naomi's pulse spiked, her mind racing through her options. She glanced at DeLuca, who was now watching the exchange with a look of mild amusement. This encounter was quickly spiraling out of control, and her target was slipping away. But if she resisted, she knew Thompson wouldn't back down. Taking a deep breath, Naomi decided to follow Thompson outside, hoping she could resolve this without further compromising her mission. A clash of wills. Naomi followed Officer Thompson out of the cafe, every step feeling like a betrayal of her training and instincts. She'd spent years building an impeccable reputation in the FBI, becoming one of their most trusted undercover agents. Every operation demanded meticulous preparation, attention to detail, and an ability to adapt under pressure. But nothing could have prepared her for this. to be confronted by a law enforcement officer who had no idea who she was, nor the importance of her mission. Outside, the bustling street provided a sharp contrast to the tension building between her and Officer Thompson. People walked by, oblivious to the confrontation unfolding just a few feet away. Naomi forced herself to remain calm as Thompson turned to face her, his expression stern and expectant. "All right, let's cut the act," Thompson said, his voice edged with impatience. "You mind explaining why you were watching everyone in there like a hawk? Seemed pretty suspicious to me." Naomi fought the urge to roll her eyes. Of all the scenarios she prepared for, dealing with an overzealous local cop had not been one of them. She was on edge, her mind racing with every possible outcome, but she knew that anger would only play into his hands. She needed to de-escalate this before her mission unraveled. "Officer, I'm not sure what you're getting at," she replied, maintaining a carefully neutral tone. "I was simply having a coffee, taking a break. There's no law against sitting in a cafe, is there?" But Thompson wasn't backing down. His eyes narrowed, his posture rigid as he folded his arms across his chest. "Look, I know people. I know when someone doesn't belong in you. You stand out," he said, the disdain in his voice unmistakable. "I think you're hiding something, and I intend to find out what." Naomi felt her jaw clench. The insinuation wasn't lost on her. She had dealt with men like Thompson before, men who believed they could see through others with a glance, who judged people's worth based on appearance, background, or worse, skin color. It was a prejudice she'd encountered throughout her life and career, but rarely with such boldness. She took a steadying breath, fighting back her frustration. "If there's no valid reason for detaining me, I'd like to get back to my table," she said, hoping her calm resolve would convince him to let her go. But Thompson took a step closer, his face mere inches from hers. "And if I don't let you go, what then?" he challenged, his voice low, as though he were daring her to protest. The brazenness of his intimidation was infuriating, and Naomi felt her control slipping. But her years in the bureau had taught her patience, and now more than ever she needed it. Any sudden reaction would only worsen the situation, potentially drawing even more unwanted attention to herself, and DeLuca would vanish, perhaps permanently. In the silence that stretched between them, Thompson's expression hardened, as though her lack of fear was a challenge he wasn't accustomed to. Naomi noticed the way he held his shoulders, the faint smirk tugging at his lips, the sense of power he seemed to relish. She knew exactly what kind of man he was, and she had no intention of letting him have the last word. "So, what's it going to be?" she asked, her voice firm yet controlled. "Are you arresting me for drinking coffee?" Thompson's smirk faded, replaced by a look of annoyance. He leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I wanted to, I could find a reason," he muttered. "People like you don't walk around unnoticed, Miss Carter. You can fool the others, but not me." Naomi's patience snapped. She straightened, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him pause. "People like me," she repeated, her voice cold. "Tell me, Officer Thompson, what exactly do you mean by that?" Caught off guard, Thompson faltered for a moment, the faintest trace of uncertainty flickering across his face, but he quickly regained his composure, the smugness returning. "Just don't cause any trouble," he said, his voice stiff. "Consider this a warning." "Warning noted," Naomi replied, forcing herself to remain composed, even as she felt the injustice of the situation clawing at her. But before she could turn back, Thompson reached out, gripping her arm. The restraint was firm but not painful, a gesture that seemed as much about control as it was about enforcing authority. "We're not done here," he said, his tone low and threatening. "I think you should come down to the station for a few questions." Naomi's heart sank. The last thing she could afford was to be detained, especially with DeLuca watching. She glanced around, noticing a few curious onlookers pausing, drawn by the commotion. If this continued, she'd attract more attention, and DeLuca would undoubtedly slip away. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, trying one last time to appeal to his reason. "I haven't done anything wrong, and you know it." But Thompson's grip tightened, his eyes flashing with defiance. "Just cooperate," he said, as though her compliance was a formality rather than a necessity. A quick glance back into the cafe confirmed her worst fear. DeLuca was watching, his expression unreadable but undeniably aware of the situation. This was exactly the kind of exposure she had hoped to avoid. If he suspected even for a moment that she was connected to law enforcement, her cover, and the months of planning leading up to this operation, would be compromised. But she knew she couldn't let Thompson drag her into an argument here on the street. Instead, she took a steadying breath and nodded. "Fine," she replied, concealing the bitterness in her voice. "Let's go." Thompson's smug expression deepened as he led her toward his squad car parked around the corner. Naomi felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. She still had her earpiece, and as soon as they were out of earshot, she muttered, "Jameson, are you there?" "Naomi, what's happening?" Jameson's voice came through, tense and concerned. "I'm being detained by Officer Mark Thompson. He doesn't know who I am, but he's not letting it go." There was a pause on the other end. Then Jameson cursed under his breath. "We'll get this sorted, but stay calm. Naomi, don't let him see you rattled." She took a deep breath, silently cursing Thompson's arrogance and short-sightedness. Her job required discretion and precision, two qualities this officer seemed completely oblivious to. As she was led to the squad car, she caught a glimpse of DeLuca once more, watching her with a strange look, a faint smirk on his face. If he had suspected her before, now he knew. Her cover was as good as blown, and the stakes of her mission had just escalated exponentially. The station. The trip to the station was tense and silent. Thompson drove with the same smug satisfaction Naomi had come to expect from him, occasionally glancing at her through the rearview mirror as if to gauge her reaction. But Naomi was determined to show nothing. She sat quietly, her face a mask of calm control, though her mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts. Once they arrived, Thompson led her into the station, pushing open the heavy doors with an air of authority. Officers glanced at them as they passed, some with curiosity, others with thinly veiled judgment. Naomi knew how it must look. A woman, handcuffed and led into the station, her expression steely, her silence unwavering. He took her to an empty interrogation room, finally releasing her wrists from the cuffs. She flexed her hands, the red marks on her skin a stinging reminder of the indignity she had just endured. "Wait here," he commanded, stepping out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving Naomi alone in the sterile, dimly lit room. She exhaled slowly, allowing herself a brief moment of vulnerability. Everything she'd worked for was unraveling because of a single man's arrogance, but she wouldn't let this defeat her. She adjusted her earpiece, hoping to pick up a signal. "Jameson, do you copy?" Loud and clear, "Naomi," came his reassuring voice. "We're working on it. Stay put. I'm pulling every string I can." "Understood," she replied, her voice steely. She knew Jameson would do everything in his power to get her out, but the damage was done. DeLuca would likely disappear into the shadows, and her mission might be irreparably compromised. And as she waited in the cold, unyielding room, Naomi resolved that she would find a way to complete this mission, no matter what obstacles lay ahead. She wasn't done yet. A misjudgment exposed. Naomi sat alone in the dim interrogation room, her frustration and anger simmering just beneath her calm exterior. She knew how easily moments like these could test her resolve, but losing control was not an option. Years of training had instilled in her the discipline to maintain her composure, but this situation was beginning to test even her formidable patience. The silence in the room was thick and oppressive. Naomi glanced around, observing the sparse, cold walls, the single metal table, and the hard chair she sat on. This was a place designed to intimidate, to strip people of their power, and make them feel small. But she wasn't just anyone. She was Agent Naomi Carter, and this was not her first time facing adversity. The difference now was that the people working against her should have been her allies. After a while, the door swung open, and Officer Thompson entered, his posture radiating authority. He carried a clipboard in one hand, glancing at it briefly before directing his gaze back to Naomi. She could see the smug satisfaction in his eyes, the assumption that he had already won. "Miss Carter," he began, taking the seat across from her. His tone was casual, almost friendly, as if he believed they were engaging in a normal conversation. "Let's start again. Why don't you tell me what you were really doing in that cafe?" Naomi held his gaze, unflinching. "I've already told you, officer. I was having coffee," she replied, her tone measured but firm. Thompson smirked, shaking his head slightly. "You expect me to believe that? A woman like you, sitting alone in that cafe, watching everyone around you. You were nervous, constantly looking over your shoulder. Doesn't add up, Miss Carter." Naomi's patience was thinning, but she held her composure. "Are you questioning my right to sit in a cafe and mind my own business?" Thompson leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. "It's not about rights, Miss Carter. It's about intentions. I don't trust people who think they can waltz into any place and act like they belong. You don't belong there. And now you're here." Her eyes narrowed slightly. The insinuation was clear. This wasn't about her behavior. This was about who he perceived her to be. Her fingers clenched, and she took a slow, steadying breath. She had spent years overcoming the limitations others had tried to place on her. She had defied expectations, excelled in her career, and earned her position as an FBI agent. But here she was, reduced to a suspicious figure by a man who couldn't see past his own bias. "I've cooperated with you, officer," she said calmly. "I've answered every question, and I've shown you my ID. Yet you're still determined to treat me like a criminal. Why is that?" Thompson's expression hardened, his jaw tightening. "People like you think you can get away with anything, walking around with an air of entitlement, thinking the rules don't apply to you." Naomi's patience snapped. "People like me," she repeated, her voice sharp. "What exactly do you mean by that, Officer Thompson?" For the first time, Thompson looked taken aback, as if she had struck a nerve. But he quickly regained his composure, his gaze icy and unyielding. "You know what I mean," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think you can walk into places you don't belong and do whatever you want. Not on my watch." Naomi's fists clenched under the table. She had spent her life fighting against these kinds of assumptions, proving her worth in a system that often underestimated her. And now, all her accomplishments, her dedication, and her sacrifices were being dismissed by a man who saw only what he wanted to see. The door opened again, interrupting their tense standoff. Officer Richards, Thompson's partner, entered the room, casting a hesitant glance at both of them. Naomi noticed the discomfort in his expression, the way his gaze flickered between her and Thompson, as though he was witnessing something he didn't entirely agree with. Mark," Richards began, shifting awkwardly. "I need to speak with you outside for a moment." Thompson frowned but rose to his feet, casting one last look at Naomi before leaving the room with Richards. The door clicked shut behind them, and Naomi released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Alone again, she felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her, but she refused to let it defeat her. Meanwhile, just outside the room, Richards hesitated before speaking. He glanced down the hallway, ensuring they were alone, then turned to Thompson with a serious expression. "Mark, don't you think you're overreacting?" he asked, his tone cautious but firm. "She hasn't done anything wrong. There's no real evidence to detain her. You're acting on assumptions." Thompson scoffed, dismissing Richards's concern. "You saw her in that cafe, didn't you? Acting all suspicious, pretending to be something she's not. I don't trust people like her." "People like her," Richards repeated, his voice laced with unease. "What are you talking about, Mark?" You're treating her like a criminal without any reason." Thompson's expression darkened. "I don't need a reason to trust my instincts," he said sharply. "She doesn't belong here, and I'm going to make sure she knows it." Richards shifted uncomfortably, clearly conflicted. He knew Thompson's history, his reputation for taking a hardline approach to policing, but this felt different. It felt wrong. "Mark, we need to be careful here," he said quietly. "We can't just assume things about people. You could be jeopardizing her rights and our own credibility." But Thompson dismissed his concerns with a wave of his hand. "If you're too soft to handle this, Richards, then maybe you should step aside. I'm doing what needs to be done." Richards said nothing, but the conflict in his eyes was evident. He watched as Thompson re-entered the interrogation room, his stomach churning with a mixture of guilt and doubt. He couldn't shake the feeling that Thompson was making a serious mistake, one that could have lasting consequences. Back in the room, Thompson resumed his position across from Naomi, his gaze hard and unforgiving. Naomi returned his stare with an unwavering resolve, refusing to let him intimidate her. She was done playing by his rules. "Let's try this again," Thompson said, his tone icy. "Why don't you tell me what you were really doing in that cafe?" But Naomi had had enough. She leaned forward, her voice low and steady. "Do you know who I am, Officer Thompson? Do you have any idea?" His smirk faltered, but he quickly masked it with a look of defiance. "You're a suspect. That's who you are." She allowed herself a small, bitter smile. "No, Officer Thompson. I'm Special Agent Naomi Carter, with the FBI." For the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face, but he quickly recovered. "Nice try," he said, his voice laced with sarcasm. "But I don't buy it." Naomi remained silent, letting her words sink in. Thompson's expression shifted, uncertainty finally breaking through his arrogance as he glanced toward the door. He seemed to hesitate, the weight of her words beginning to take hold. But before he could respond, the door opened once more, and Agent Jameson entered, his face set in a look of controlled fury. He strode across the room, ignoring Thompson's protests, and approached Naomi, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Are you all right, Agent Carter?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Naomi nodded, though the tension in her body remained. "I'm fine, Agent Jameson." Jameson turned to Thompson, his expression hard and unyielding. "Officer Thompson, do you have any idea what you've done? You've jeopardized a federal operation, harassed a federal agent, and undermined months of work." Thompson's face went pale, his bravado crumbling as the reality of his actions began to sink in. He stammered, his usual confidence nowhere to be found. I didn't know. I thought." "Exactly," Jameson interrupted, his voice cold. "You thought, but you didn't know. And now, because of your reckless behavior, this operation is at risk. DeLuca may have already gone underground because of you." Thompson's gaze dropped, his face flushed with shame. Richards, standing in the doorway, looked equally shaken, his expression a mix of guilt and relief that someone was finally holding Thompson accountable. Naomi rose from her chair, her gaze steady as she looked at Thompson. "For the record, Officer Thompson, I don't need your permission to sit in a cafe. I don't need your approval to exist in a space you think I don't belong in. I am here because I have a job to do, a job that I'm good at. And if you had looked past your own assumptions for 1 second, you might have realized that." Thompson said nothing, his silence an admission of his misjudgment. Naomi turned to leave, pausing only long enough to offer Richards a nod of acknowledgement. She could see the regret in his eyes, the unspoken apology, and while it didn't erase what had happened, it was enough. As she walked out of the station with Jameson, a renewed sense of purpose filled her. This incident was just another reminder of the obstacles she faced, not just from criminals, but from those who were supposed to be on her side. But she wouldn't let it stop her. She was Special Agent Naomi Carter, and she had a mission to complete: redemption in the shadows. Naomi strode out of the police station with Agent Jameson by her side, her face set in a determined expression. She was still reeling from the confrontation with Officer Thompson, the wounds of his prejudice and arrogance fresh in her mind, but there was no time to dwell on it now. The mission was in jeopardy, and DeLuca's trail was growing colder by the minute. The two agents climbed into the unmarked SUV parked a few blocks from the station. The moment the doors closed, Jameson turned to her, his face a mask of apology and frustration. "Naomi, I'm so sorry this happened," he said, his voice tight with anger. "If I'd known Thompson was going to pull a stunt like this, I would have intervened sooner." Naomi shook her head, forcing a tight smile. "It's not your fault, Jameson. Thompson's prejudice blinded him. He didn't see me for who I am. He only saw who he assumed I was." Jameson let out a frustrated sigh, gripping the steering wheel. "It's unacceptable. You shouldn't have to deal with this, not when you're one of the best agents we have." He paused, his jaw clenched. "But right now, we need to get back on DeLuca's trail. I've alerted our surveillance team. He might still be in the area, but if he caught on to the situation with Thompson..." Naomi nodded, her mind racing. She had worked on this case for months, piecing together the fragmented world of art trafficking and stolen antiquities that DeLuca orchestrated with a chilling ease. But her operation had hinged on staying invisible, on being just another face in the crowd. Thompson's interruption had compromised that cover, making her position precarious. "Did we get anything from the cafe cameras?" she asked, trying to focus on the task at hand. Jameson's face brightened slightly. "Yes. We've isolated footage of DeLuca's contact, the man he met with. A nondescript guy, but he had a tattoo on his wrist. It matches the profile of Marco Voss, one of DeLuca's main smugglers." Naomi's eyes narrowed in recognition. Voss was a notorious figure in the art world, known for his brutal tactics and the network of underground contacts he maintained. If DeLuca had involved Voss, it meant this deal was high stakes, and that DeLuca was playing for keeps. "Where did Voss go after the meeting?" she asked, leaning forward as Jameson pulled up a digital map on the dashboard screen. "Our team tracked him to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city," Jameson replied, pointing to a blinking red dot on the map. "It's one of DeLuca's suspected storage facilities. We've never had the evidence to justify a raid, but this could be our chance." Naomi's heart quickened. If DeLuca was planning to move his stolen inventory, this might be the last opportunity to catch him red-handed. She glanced at Jameson, her determination steeling her nerves. "Then let's go," she said, her voice unwavering. The SUV wound its way through the darkening city streets, the bustling energy of downtown giving way to the quieter, grittier outskirts. The warehouse district was deserted at this hour, its silence punctuated only by the occasional hum of distant traffic or the flickering of a broken streetlight. The scent of damp concrete and rust lingered in the air as they approached the warehouse, a nondescript structure with high, narrow windows and a padlocked entrance. Naomi and Jameson parked a short distance away, choosing a spot obscured by shadows. They checked their weapons, the silence between them charged with the tension of the operation. Naomi could feel her pulse quicken, her senses heightening in anticipation. This was her element, the thrill of the unknown, the challenge of outsmarting a criminal who thrived in darkness. "All right, Naomi," Jameson whispered, nodding toward the warehouse. "We'll split up. I'll enter from the north side and keep watch. You head to the east entrance. If DeLuca or Voss are inside, we'll catch them in a crossfire." Naomi nodded, her grip tightening on her firearm. She took a deep breath, her training kicking in as she slipped through the shadows, her movements swift and silent. The adrenaline coursed through her veins, sharpening her focus and silencing the lingering frustrations from earlier. Her mind zeroed in on the mission. Every step, every decision was deliberate, calculated. As she neared the east entrance, Naomi spotted a faint light emanating from a high window, illuminating the faint outline of stacked crates and shadows moving within. She pressed herself against the cold metal door, listening closely to the low voices drifting through the cracks. DeLuca and Voss were in there, discussing something in hushed tones. She couldn't make out the words, but their urgency was unmistakable. "Jameson, I'm in position," she whispered into her earpiece. "Target sighted. DeLuca and Voss are inside, but I don't have a clear line of sight." "Copy that," Jameson replied, his voice calm but alert. "Hold your position. I'm approaching from the north." Naomi waited, her heart pounding as she kept her ears trained on the muffled conversation. She could hear snippets now, references to a shipment and a buyer set to arrive any minute. She strained to hear more, but her attention was pulled elsewhere as another sound echoed down the alley. A heavy, deliberate footfall, followed by the faint murmur of a radio. Her blood went cold. It was Officer Thompson. He must have followed them from the station, unwilling to let his suspicions go, his arrogance now leading him to tread dangerously close to an active FBI operation. She watched as he moved down the alley, his flashlight slicing through the darkness, the beam illuminating the east entrance where she crouched. Naomi pressed herself against the wall, willing herself invisible, praying he wouldn't see her. "Naomi," Jameson hissed over the comm, sensing the shift in her posture. "What's going on?" "Thompson's here," she whispered back, her voice barely audible. "He followed us. He's going to blow our cover." Jameson cursed softly. "Stay put. I'll handle him." But before Jameson could reach them, Thompson's flashlight swung toward Naomi, his eyes narrowing as he spotted her, his face twisted in anger. And he raised his voice, his tone a harsh whisper that cut through the night. "Miss Carter, what the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, his flashlight trained on her like a spotlight. Naomi could feel her heartbeat pounding in her ears, her muscles tensing with the urge to yell at him to leave, to warn him of the risk he was taking. But she knew that any loud reaction could alert DeLuca and Voss, compromising the mission even further. She forced herself to remain calm, meeting his gaze with a steady stare. "Officer Thompson," she whispered harshly, "you're compromising a federal operation. You need to leave. Now." But Thompson seemed unfazed, his face set in a stubborn scowl. "I knew something was up. You're not fooling anyone, Carter. You may think you're above the law. But out here, in my city, you answer to me." Naomi clenched her jaw, her anger barely contained. This wasn't just a matter of arrogance now. Thompson's refusal to back down was a direct threat to her mission, and potentially to their lives. She took a deep breath, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm ordering you to leave, Officer Thompson," she said, her tone edged with authority. "This is a federal investigation. If you interfere, you're putting both of us in danger." But before Thompson could respond, the warehouse door creaked open, and the murmur of voices grew louder. Naomi's blood ran cold as she realized DeLuca and Voss had heard them. Thompson's flashlight had drawn their attention, and now they were stepping out into the alley, their silhouettes framed in the dim light. Naomi's instincts took over. In one swift movement, she raised her firearm, her gaze locked on DeLuca as he froze, his eyes widening in shock and recognition. "Freeze," she commanded, her voice low but deadly. But DeLuca was already in motion, his hand reaching for his weapon as he dove behind a stack of crates. Voss followed suit, pulling out a pistol and firing a shot that ricocheted off the alley wall. Thompson shouted, his voice a mix of surprise and anger, as he stumbled backward, nearly dropping his flashlight. "Get down," Naomi shouted, throwing herself behind a stack of crates as bullets flew through the air, the sharp cracks of gunfire echoing in the confined alley. She could see Thompson scrambling for cover, his face a mixture of shock and fear. In that moment, his arrogance had crumbled, replaced by a raw vulnerability he couldn't hide. "Jameson, we're compromised," Naomi called into her comm, her voice strained as she returned fire, forcing Voss and DeLuca deeper into the alley. "Thompson's in the line of fire. We need backup. Hold tight, Naomi." Jameson's voice came through, tense but controlled. Reinforcements are on the way. Keep them pinned down." Naomi gritted her teeth, her focus razor-sharp as she continued to fire. Each shot calculated, her movements efficient and precise. This was her world, her territory, and she wouldn't let anyone, least of all Officer Thompson, undermine her mission. She saw Voss attempting to reload, his movements hurried and panicked. She seized the moment, leaning out and firing a shot that hit him squarely in the shoulder, sending him crashing to the ground with a cry of pain. DeLuca, realizing he was cornered, raised his hands in surrender, his face twisted in rage. He glanced between Naomi and Thompson, his expression one of utter disdain. "You think you've won?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. "This isn't over, Agent Carter." Naomi didn't respond, her gaze cold as she signaled for him to stay down. She held her weapon steady, her breathing controlled, her focus unbreakable. But as the echoes of the gunfire faded, she felt the weight of what had just happened settle over her. Thompson, still crouched behind a crate, looked up at her, his face pale and shaken. For the first time, she saw him not as an obstacle, but as a man who had let his pride and prejudice blind him to the reality around him. You really are FBI," he murmured, his voice a whisper of disbelief. Naomi met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Officer Thompson, I am." And with that, she turned her attention back to DeLuca, her purpose clearer than ever. This mission wasn't just about bringing a criminal to justice. It was about proving that she belonged, no matter who tried to stand in her way. A reckoning of principles. Naomi kept her gun trained on DeLuca, her eyes unwavering, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The alley was silent now, save for the distant wail of approaching sirens as backup neared. Officer Thompson, still pale and shaken, had retreated to the side, his gaze flickering between Naomi and DeLuca, clearly grappling with the weight of his previous assumptions. Agent Jameson entered the alley moments later, flanked by a team of FBI agents in tactical gear, their weapons drawn as they moved swiftly to apprehend DeLuca and Voss. The once elusive criminals were now cornered, their plans shattered, their last refuge breached. Naomi watched as the agents secured DeLuca's hands behind his back, her heart settling as the mission's success began to sink in. DeLuca sneered as they dragged him past her, his face twisted with contempt. "You think this ends here, Agent Carter?" He spat, his voice low and venomous. "You're nothing but a cog in a machine. There's 100 more like me waiting in the shadows." Naomi met his gaze with cold defiance. "Then they'll meet the same end you did," she replied, her tone resolute. DeLuca was led away, his threats dissipating into the night. The tactical team dispersed, leaving Naomi, Jameson, and Thompson alone in the dimly lit alley. Jameson approached her, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and relief. "Well done, Naomi," he said, his voice warm with genuine admiration. "You handled yourself with exceptional poise. I don't know many agents who could have managed under those circumstances." Naomi allowed herself a brief nod of acknowledgement, but her gaze shifted to Thompson, who lingered a few steps away, his face shadowed by a mixture of embarrassment and regret. His once confident posture had crumbled, leaving behind a man stripped of his self-assured authority, confronting the reality of his mistakes. Jameson seemed to sense the tension and took a step back, allowing them space. Naomi turned to Thompson, crossing her arms as she studied him, her expression unreadable. She had spent years proving herself in an institution that was often unforgiving to those who looked like her, who spoke like her, who didn't fit the stereotypical mold. And here was a man who, in a single night, had tried to undo that, all because he couldn't see past his own biases. "You know," she began, her tone measured but sharp, "tonight, you didn't just jeopardize a federal operation. You risked lives, mine, Jameson's, and even your own." Thompson shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the ground. I didn't realize," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought. You thought you knew better, Naomi interrupted, her voice laced with controlled anger. You thought you understood the situation because you looked at me and made assumptions. You didn't see an FBI agent. You saw someone who didn't belong. He looked up, his expression pained. I was wrong, he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. I let my own biases cloud my judgment. And I'm sorry, Agent Carter. Naomi regarded him for a moment, her anger softening slightly, but she didn't let him off the hook just yet. Do you know how many times I've faced men like you? She asked quietly. People who look at me and see a stereotype instead of a professional. It's exhausting, Officer Thompson. But tonight, you went beyond that. You didn't just underestimate me. You endangered me. Thompson nodded slowly, his expression shadowed with shame. I've been on the force a long time, he began, struggling to find the words. But maybe too long. I've seen so many faces, so many people who fit a certain profile. I started thinking I could tell who people were just by looking at them. But I was wrong about you, and I can see that now. Naomi studied him, searching for sincerity in his expression. There was a flicker of genuine remorse in his eyes, a glimmer of understanding that hadn't been there before. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the night's events beginning to settle over her. Apologies don't undo the damage, Officer Thompson, she said, her voice softer now, but still firm. But if you're serious about changing, then maybe this experience will mean something. Maybe you'll start to question your assumptions, to look beyond the surface. Thompson nodded, his face set with a determination that seemed almost desperate. I will, he said, his voice filled with a quiet resolve. I owe it to you, to everyone, to be better. Naomi held his gaze, feeling a faint spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, he meant it. She gave him a curt nod, acknowledging his promise without fully forgiving him. This was a beginning, but only that, a step toward accountability in a system that often avoided it. Jameson approached, clearing his throat slightly. Naomi, we need to get back to headquarters for debriefing, he said, casting a brief glance at Thompson. But before we go, I want you to know that this won't go unaddressed. Officer Thompson's actions tonight will be reported. There will be consequences. Naomi nodded, but her focus was already shifting. DeLuca's arrest was only one piece of a larger puzzle. His capture had disrupted his network, but there were still countless players in the shadows waiting to take his place. She knew her work was far from over. Thank you, Jameson, she replied, her voice steady. But right now, I'm more interested in making sure DeLuca's organization falls apart. This operation isn't finished yet. Jameson's face softened with a small smile, admiration evident in his eyes. That's the Naomi Carter I know. We'll tear down every part of his network, piece by piece. They began to walk back toward the SUV, leaving Thompson standing in the alley, his figure silhouetted against the dim streetlights. Naomi could feel the weight of his gaze on her back, but she didn't turn around. She had done what she could to open his eyes, to show him the consequences of his prejudice. The rest was up to him. Back at FBI headquarters, Naomi and Jameson sat in a glass-walled conference room, the faint hum of computers and muted conversations filling the air. The atmosphere was charged with the electric energy of a successful operation, but Naomi's mind was already at work, analyzing the information they had gathered from DeLuca and his associates. Jameson poured them each a cup of coffee, his gaze thoughtful as he regarded her across the table. Naomi, he began, his tone cautious. Are you sure you're all right? Tonight was a lot. Naomi took a sip of her coffee, the bitter warmth grounding her. I'm fine, Jameson. Just frustrated. This isn't the first time I've been judged by someone who should know better. But it won't be the last either. I've learned to live with it. Jameson's expression softened, a look of sympathy crossing his face. I don't want you to have to live with it, Naomi. You deserve better than that. She managed a small smile, appreciating his support. Thank you. But my focus is on the job. We caught DeLuca, and now it's time to dismantle his network. I won't let one bad cop's prejudice get in the way of that." Jameson nodded, his respect for her clear in his gaze. "I don't doubt it, and I'll make sure the Bureau knows exactly how well you handled this operation, despite the setbacks." They reviewed the night's events, analyzing the details and discussing the next steps. Every word, every glance between them spoke of their shared determination to see the mission through. DeLuca's capture was only the beginning, and they both knew the work ahead would be grueling. But they were ready. After the debriefing, Naomi walked through the quiet corridors of the FBI headquarters, her footsteps echoing softly. She paused by a window, looking out over the city lights that stretched into the distance. Somewhere out there, DeLuca's associates were no doubt scrambling, their carefully orchestrated plans unraveling in the wake of his arrest. She felt a sense of satisfaction, a quiet pride in knowing she had struck a blow against the criminal network she had fought to bring down. But as she stood there, she knew that this night had changed more than just her case. It had reminded her of the deeper fight she faced, a battle not just against criminals, but against the prejudices embedded in the very system she served. It was a battle that wouldn't end with a single conversation or a single apology. It would be a continuous effort, a constant challenge to prove her worth in a world that still struggled to see her for who she truly was. Taking a deep breath, Naomi squared her shoulders, her resolve hardening. She was an FBI agent, a woman who had risen above countless challenges, and she would continue to do so, no matter who tried to stand in her way. With a renewed sense of purpose, Naomi turned and walked away from the window, ready to face whatever lay ahead. The unfinished mission. 2 weeks had passed since the night Naomi Carter had cornered Thomas DeLuca in that dark alley. The arrest had sent shockwaves through the criminal underworld, causing several of DeLuca's contacts and associates to go into hiding. But this was only the start of Naomi's work. Taking down DeLuca was one thing. Dismantling the web he had woven required something far more intricate. Naomi had barely taken a moment to rest since that night. She poured herself into the investigation, tracking down leads, interrogating informants, and poring over seized documents late into the night. The deeper she delved, the more she realized how vast and insidious DeLuca's operation was. His network spanned continents, connecting smugglers, corrupt officials, and a network of buyers who fueled the lucrative black market for stolen art and artifacts. One evening, as Naomi sat alone in her dimly lit office, her desk cluttered with files and coffee cups, Agent Jameson knocked softly on the door before stepping in. He looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern, knowing the toll this mission had taken on her. "Naomi, you've been here every night since DeLuca's arrest," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You need a break. You're running yourself into the ground." Naomi looked up, a flicker of exhaustion in her eyes, but her resolve remained unshaken. "I can't afford to slow down, Jameson. DeLuca may be in custody, but his network is still out there. Every hour we wait, his people have a chance to regroup, to bury evidence, to disappear." Jameson sighed, crossing his arms as he leaned against the doorframe. "I understand, but you're not in this alone. You've already done more than anyone expected. You've proven your resilience, not just to the Bureau, but to yourself." Naomi's gaze softened, and she leaned back, letting his words sink in. It was true. This case had tested her in ways she hadn't anticipated, pushing her to confront not only the criminals she hunted, but the prejudices within her own ranks. The memory of Officer Thompson's condescending gaze, his stubborn arrogance, lingered in her mind, a reminder of the barriers she continued to face. "Thank you, Jameson," she said quietly, offering him a small smile. "But I'm not ready to let this go yet. I need to see this through." He nodded, his expression one of understanding and respect. "All right, but don't forget to look after yourself. If you need anything, you know where to find me." As he left, Naomi returned to her files, her mind already racing with plans and possibilities. She knew that capturing DeLuca was a victory, but it was also just the beginning. His network was like a hydra. Cut off one head, and two more would take its place. She needed to strike at the heart, to find the weak link that would unravel the entire operation. The next day, Naomi received a call that sent her racing out of her office. A lead had come through. One of DeLuca's trusted lieutenants had resurfaced, a man named Carlos Rivas. Rivas was notorious for his ruthless efficiency and unwavering loyalty to DeLuca. If she could get to him, he might hold the key to exposing the deeper layers of the organization. Naomi and Jameson assembled a team, strategizing the plan with meticulous detail. They would stake out Rivas's last known location, a nondescript apartment building on the outskirts of the city. The operation would be delicate. Rivas was armed, dangerous, and would likely flee at the first sign of law enforcement. As dusk settled over the city, Naomi found herself in the passenger seat of an unmarked van parked across from the apartment building. She watched the building intently, her senses sharp and focused. The team communicated in low whispers, each movement calculated, each gesture a signal in their well-rehearsed operation. Hours passed, the silence punctuated only by the faint sounds of the city around them. Finally, just as Naomi's patience was wearing thin, the door to the building opened, and a figure emerged. Rivas. He was taller than she'd expected, with a powerful build and a face shadowed by stubble, his movements swift and assured as he scanned the street. "Target is moving," Jameson murmured into his radio, his voice steady, but charged with anticipation. Naomi nodded, her gaze locked on Rivas. She could feel the adrenaline kicking in, her instincts sharpening as she prepared to make her move. Rivas walked down the street, his pace brisk but unhurried, as though he had nothing to hide. But Naomi knew better. This was a man who thrived in the underworld, who understood the value of blending into the shadows. The team followed at a safe distance, moving as one cohesive unit, their footsteps silent, their presence undetected. Naomi's heart raced as they trailed him, every nerve on edge, every sense attuned to the slightest movement. She had done this countless times before, but this time, the stakes felt even higher. She wasn't just chasing a criminal. She was pursuing justice for every barrier she'd faced, every assumption she'd had to dismantle. Rivas led them to an industrial area on the outskirts of the city, where abandoned warehouses loomed like giants in the fading light. Naomi signaled for the team to fan out, surrounding the area as Rivas entered one of the warehouses, disappearing into the shadows. She waited a beat, then followed, her movements swift and silent, as she slipped through the entrance. Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, filled with rows of crates and shipping containers stacked haphazardly. She could hear Rivas's footsteps echoing through the cavernous space, his silhouette moving between the stacks. Naomi kept her distance, her senses sharp, her breathing steady as she tracked him. Suddenly, Rivas stopped, his figure frozen in the shadows. Naomi paused, her hand hovering over her weapon, her gaze fixed on him. He turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they met hers. For a moment, they stared at each other, a tense silence stretching between them. "You don't belong here, Agent Carter," Rivas said, his voice low and taunting. "This world isn't for people like you." Naomi's grip tightened on her weapon, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be," she replied, her voice steady and unwavering. "And I'm here to dismantle everything you and DeLuca built." Rivas chuckled, a cold, mirthless sound. "You think you can stop us? We're everywhere. You take one of us down, and 10 more will rise." Naomi took a step forward, her gaze fierce and unyielding. "Then I'll keep going. I'll take down every last one of you if I have to." Rivas's expression hardened, his hand moving toward his weapon. In a split second, Naomi reacted, her movements precise and practiced. She raised her gun, her voice firm. "Don't even think about it, Rivas." But Rivas hesitated only for a moment before lunging forward, his hand reaching for his gun. Naomi fired, the shot ringing out in the warehouse, the sound reverberating off the walls. Rivas stumbled, his face contorting in pain as he dropped to his knees, clutching his shoulder. Within seconds, Jameson and the rest of the team surged forward, securing Rivas and disarming him. Naomi kept her weapon trained on him, her gaze cold as she watched him struggle, his expression a mix of pain and defiance. "You may have taken down DeLuca," Rivas sneered, his voice laced with bitterness. "But you'll never take down the rest of us. You don't have the strength." Naomi stepped closer, her voice low but filled with a quiet fury. "Don't underestimate my strength, Rivas. I fought harder battles than this one. And I'm still standing." Rivas's gaze flickered with a hint of fear, his bravado faltering. Naomi turned to Jameson, her expression resolute. "Get him out of here. He'll talk once he realizes there's no escape." As the team led Rivas away, Naomi allowed herself a moment to breathe, her heart settling as the adrenaline began to fade. She looked around the empty warehouse, the echoes of the struggle still lingering in the air. This place, this darkness, was where she had proven herself again and again, where she had fought not only criminals but the unseen forces that doubted her. Back at headquarters, Naomi sat in the interrogation room, watching Rivas through the two-way mirror. He was silent, his face pale, his bravado finally broken as he faced the reality of his situation. She knew he would talk, eventually. And when he did, she would be ready to use every piece of information he gave to dismantle DeLuca's empire, brick by brick. Jameson entered the observation room, standing beside her as they watched Rivas. "He'll give us what we need," he said confidently. "You've broken him, Naomi." Naomi nodded, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over her. "One way or another, we'll finish this," she replied, her voice steady. "And then maybe I can finally rest." Jameson looked at her with a mixture of pride and admiration. "You've done something incredible here, Naomi. You've shown all of us, this team, this agency, what it means to persevere. And you've proven, beyond any doubt, that you belong here." She met his gaze, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Jameson. That means more than you know." As she turned to leave the observation room, Naomi felt a sense of closure beginning to settle over her. The mission was far from over, but she had reclaimed her purpose, her identity, and her strength. She was more than just an agent. She was a force to be reckoned with, a woman who had faced prejudice and doubt, and emerged stronger on the other side. Stepping into the corridor, she felt the weight of the past weeks begin to lift, replaced by a new determination. She would continue her work, tearing down the walls of corruption and injustice, one case at a time. And nothing, no bias, no assumption, no criminal network would stand in her way. As Naomi Carter walked down the long, quiet hallway, she knew one thing for certain. She was right where she was meant to be.